Hello everyone, welcome to the second video on my British Championship finals, and this time we're actually going to see a full game. I am here playing Matthew Wadsworth, who is an international master, very strong player. His technical ability is incredible, and he's only 20 years old, and I believe has 2 IM norms already, so he'll be, 2 GM norms already, so I think he'll be a GM fairly soon. Has a rating of over 2400 and usually performs at least to that ability. And we've played a couple of times before, but I never feel comfortable playing him. And as black, I decided that in this game I would try to, if he either plays e4 or c4, and if he does e4, I would have had to play very combative style. I would have played a French, but then would have tried to really upset the balance and go all out to attack him. But in the English, which he was more likely to play, I decided to play a system where it's kind of pleasant for both sides, in that white's happy, they have a slight edge, and it's hard for white to go wrong if you know what you're doing. You don't often get hacked and checkmated quickly. But the good thing for black is that it's not a critical line, in that if white does certain things, there's usually not many positions where you only have one move to not lose. In the English, black usually has quite a few different choices of moves. Some will be better than others, but they should maintain an okay position for black, with white only having a small edge. So we play the English symmetrical, and he plays the best line, which is in Marine's book on the English opening, the Grandmaster Repertoire series. I believe the English symmetrical is in the third volume, because the first volume is devoted to c4, e5, then the second volume is devoted to everything else that isn't c4, c5, the symmetrical English, and the third volume is just devoted to this. And I play this as white, where essentially black is about equal, but they have a slightly difficult game if white plays the most critical positions. And as white, I actually play the move c5 in this position, which is not accurate, but it's not really mentioned in any of the books because it's ridiculous. And black actually does have only one way of playing to maintain equality. But this did not happen. He castled, which is the best move. Then I trade. And the idea is that I play d6, move my knight to d7 to attack the queen. And Matthew knows this, or at least if he doesn't know this, he worked it out over the board. But I'd be shocked if he had not prepared this. Even though I'm nearly 300 FIDE points lower rated than him, I think, well, at least I hope that he has enough respect for me that he would have at least glanced at the opening books or some of my own games. So knight d7 is the move that I play. Even though it doesn't attack the queen, my knight usually will deploy to a square to attack the queen, e5 or c5, depending on the white moves from here. So b3 is played. White's plan is very simple: to play bishop b2, have a double fianchetto, very pleasant position for the bishops, and then put his rooks usually on d1 and c1. I play knight c5, which is, I think, is the second best move, or second most popular move. I think knight to e5 is slightly more popular from memory, but I couldn't really remember the lines, because on the call, on the Zoom call we do so that you make sure no one's using a computer or anything silly like that. My laptop, when it is on a Zoom call where you have to have your camera on and you have to be sharing your screen and you also have to be on the chess.com server so you can play your game, for some reason my laptop has performance issues, so every now and then the chess.com would basically say that I disconnected for a couple of seconds and then reconnect, so I was getting nervous that I would somehow forfeit the game by losing connection for more than about 5 seconds. So I was playing quite quickly for the first few moves. And then bishop e6 is not the most accurate move, to be honest. The reason for this is that I want to play queen d7 and then put my bishop on h3 and trade off the bishops. And e6 looked best because knight d5 for white in the future might be an opportunity for me to trade lots of pieces by taking their knight on d5. But he played the best move, bishop b2, and I continued, queen d7, going with my plan. Rook fd1, excellent move by Matthew Wadsworth. What he's noticed is bishop h3 is now playable for me, but if I play it, his bishop can just drop back into the corner on h1, avoiding the trade. So there's no point me doing that, and I played rook f to c8. Similar idea to him. I want to put my rook that's on f, not doing anything, over to the queen side and centre of the board. My feeling is that I'm not going to push my d pawn anytime soon, so there's no reason to put my rook on the d file. I may as well have it on the c file, which is an open line, and then my a rook will have to figure out what to do with that later. And he knows exactly what to do with his a rook, combat my c rook. Again, hit the a file and b file are not usually going to open for white, so he's perfectly content to put his rook on c. And here, I started to get a bit nervous because when I play very strong players, and as I've described earlier, the connection issues, I often second guess myself and think, am I playing it correctly? Am I doing anything good? Or am I just messing around playing terrible moves? There's usually a mixture. So here, I didn't quite know how to get the a rook working. One plan is to go rook b8. You can do this in any order, I think, but just for the sake of clarity, rook b8, and let's give white moves that don't really do anything. I don't know. I mean, he would never do this, but let's say, for example, he just does passing moves. The plan for black is eventually to get b5. And the reason I have to play rook b8 is so his bishop on g2 won't take me in the corner, and my rook is supporting the pawn being pushed. So here I'm fighting in the on the C and B files, and we're both having lots of control over the queen side and centre of the board. So that's where the battle will be decided. So that was option 1. I went with option 2, which I really wasn't sure of, but it's quite aggressive, a5. So my plan is trying to target his c pawn by playing a4 and trying to take on b3, or force his b pawn up one square so his c pawn will not be protected. Bishop a3, excellent move, and I'm going to do a quick plug for the commentary which is being done on this tournament. There are two very strong players who are excellent commentators, called Natasha Regan and Matthew Sadler, who have the channel Game Changer, which I will try to put a link for in the description below. And they are doing live commentary of these matches on their channel, and then uploading it afterwards, so there's a permanent record of the commentary. Obviously, I'm not allowed to watch the commentary live, because that would be extremely illegal, as I might get ideas from the Grandmaster Matthew Sadler. So, fortunately though, because they've uploaded the videos to YouTube, and also because at the end of my game I caught the very, very tail end of the commentary, I went back and looked at what they were saying, and Matthew Sadler had said that one of my plans was to play a4, which gets very complicated very quickly. I chose a move which was a lot worse than his suggestion, I think. I played rook b8. I was already starting to get very uncomfortable with my position. I can't play b5, or at least won't be able to play it for a long time, so my rook on b8 looks a bit silly. I'm amazed to announce that actually, when I went through this game just before showing it here, I switched on the computer in this position, and it said I was about equal, and I was amazed at this. So it just goes to show black can play a lot of rather counterintuitive moves and still be okay in these positions. So Matthew Wadsworth took me. If I take with the pawn, I am dropping a piece and losing the game. I don't think I would show disrespect to an international master by playing on. Yeah, if I take the bishop, he'll grab my queen. And then I will take his queen, but then he gets a free bishop with the rook. And it's over. I would resign. So I took with the rook. He played knight a4, and I suddenly realised that if I drop my rook back to c8, that's a terrible move. Can you see what what white will play here to make black maybe resign? Yeah, he's got a fork, knight b6. And the downside is if I move my rook backwards somewhere else, like c7, my a-pawn will drop from his queen. Therefore, the only reasonable move which suits my style is to swing my rook across to h5, defending my a-pawn, but also trying to get some kind of initiative on the king's side, hoping for some silly attack to work. Excellent move, c5, which is the only move for white that gives them the advantage. Everything else is about equal. Even though white's bishop on g2 is a very nice looking bishop, and their knight, even though it's on the edge, it can jump all over the place. And his rooks are excellent, and his queen is also very actively placed, and his king is safe. So the only reason that I'm not totally lost, or even much worse, is because I have the two bishops, which are just so useful, and the centre is quite open. There are no pawns blocking the centre of the board. So my two bishops make up for the fact that the rest of my pieces look ridiculous where they are. I played bishop g4, so thinking that if everything was taken on d6, I would grab the e2 pawn at the end, not going a pawn down. He took, and then it turns out I should take the pawn straight away, but I thought I might have a small chance to inflict some damage with bishop h6, skewering his queen and rook. So can you see the only move for white which will avoid them losing a queen or having one of their rooks taken? Yeah, maybe it's too simple. f4. And I've run out of attacking plans, so now perhaps I'm wrong here, but I had thought if I kept the queens on, he's got more attack than me now. So with the queens on the board, I thought he would have a very, very comfortable position. But when the queens come off, he offered the trade of bishops to deprive me of having two of them, and I willingly trade the bishops because I've doubled up his pawns. So my thinking is that a rook and a bishop work a lot better than a rook and a knight normally, in terms of how well they coordinate together. And even though I might lose a pawn coming up, if, say, I drop the d-pawn that goes off the board, his four pawns on the king side, on f to h, they are not really able to work that well against my three pawns on the king side. So in a sense, I'm not really a full pawn down if I drop, say, the d-pawn. But there's no reason for me to drop a pawn yet. I play bishop f8, knight b6, fantastic move. He's planning knight to d5, which would be pretty bad for me. So I think if I can trade one set of rooks, that will be able to take away most of his big attack. And a rook and bishop will work very well together, so maybe I can even have a slight edge in this setup. He played knight d7 and forced me to trade rooks. And here I felt really, really stupid, because there are three rook moves I have which don't lose the rook. And I spent maybe 2 or 3 minutes on this move, and I was trying to analyse all these deep variations with rook to e8. And then I finally spotted what was completely wrong about this move. What would white have played if I had played rook to e8? Yeah, they would find the fork, knight f6, which somehow I'd missed until several minutes down on my time. So with that out of the way, I can only go to D or to A, and my thinking was, whatever I do, rook c7 will be played. So there's no reason to attack the knight. I'm going to try rook a8, and he actually checked me first, which was a brilliant move, and I totally missed this. If rook c7, I would have chances to activate the bishop, but now, when I've played king g7, my bishop is completely shut in, and his knight is perfect, right in the middle of the board. In fact, I actually want my d-pawn not on the board, so my bishop can move around. It can't move at all now. So here I went rook a6, and he improved. Rook c7, again, excellent move. I can't really fault him at any point in this game so far. He's played excellent moves. And here, I think I'm actually going to congratulate myself a bit here. I think I played the only move which makes life at all difficult for white and gives me possibly enough to draw. What would you play as black? Here I need to improve my pieces. I can't really move the king anywhere good, because then rook c8 could come and pin my bishop to the king, or I'd lose the f-pawn. And I can't improve the bishop, so the only thing left to make better is my rook. If I try to move a4, it doesn't really work, because he can take on b7, and I haven't made my rook good enough. But if I save my b-pawn with a move like rook a8, rook a7, all my pieces are dreadful. Like, none of them are very good, and he can just advance his king up the board and get a winning line. So I played rook c6, dropping the b-pawn, but now my rook is on the open file. So I played rook c5. But rook c1, it turns out, is the best move. He would move his king up. The reason I didn't like this line was because his king got really active. However, my rook is good enough that even though my bishop and king are awful, with enough pawns traded, it won't matter too much. So here, the computer gives this as being only a little bit better for white, which I'd evaluated it wrongly. I thought white was completely winning, to be honest. So instead, my plan was rook c5, forcing his knight away, and then I can try improving my bishop and my rook together. So he dropped back, knight e3, and then I realised if I'm not careful and I play a move like king g8 to get the bishop and king better, he can then play knight c4, blocking my rook in and going for my pawns. But there's even other moves that are good, like a4 is a very nice move. And then his plan is rook b5, which would either trade the rooks or win my a-pawn. And if the rooks are traded, I believe he's winning, because a bishop against a knight, normally if it's equal pawns it can be drawn, or even a bit better for the bishop, but his knight will be so good, and all my pawns on the queen side are on the same colour as my bishop, and his pawns are not, so I won't be able to take any of his pawns and his king can run in. So instead, I didn't want knight c4 or a4 to happen, so I played d5, stopping knight c4 and giving my bishop some more squares. Rook d7, going for the pawn. If I drop this one, I'll then be 2 pawns down. I don't think I can be quite as rash as to give 2 pawns. So rook c1 check, king f2, bishop c5, and here I was very confident that I had at least a draw. And after king e2, I completely missed the best plan. By the way, if he takes the pawn with the rook, I can check, and his knight is pinned. So when he moves the king, I'll grab the knight, and now I'll be winning. So he played king e2, and now I played a4, and I think we both what they call saw a ghost, or saw phantoms, which are not really there. I think both of us thought he could not take this pawn on d5 without all the pawns trading off. After a takes b, he'll take me back, and I think we both were under the impression that I could take the knight, he would take back, and then check, and I would win the pawn. And then, even though he's still one pawn up on the king side, again, that extra pawn on f is not really worth it much. And I can draw in that line. I think we both would agree a draw fairly soon. But here, he simply has rook d3, and I'm completely lost. So that would have been embarrassing. I probably would have seen this before I took the knight, so I may have had to play some other move, like bishop b4 or something, but I'm definitely a lot worse. Fortunately for me, he took on a4, thinking now he's 2 pawns up, and he might win the d pawn as well, 3 pawns up, and I don't think I can survive 3 pawns down. I played rook a1, and then a move I did not see at all, knight g4, and that shocked me. I had to really concentrate here and make sure there wasn't a trick that I was missing. I had expected rook takes d5, and then I've got a very easy position. There's rook takes pawn check, he'll block, and then I can grab the pawn, and it's a fairly comfortable draw. Or if he plays a really bad move like king d3, I might actually win after rook a3 skewering his king and knight. And if he did knight takes pawn, which is the other move, again I can check and then take on a4, and again I'm 1 pawn down, but I don't really count it as a full pawn. So knight g4 surprised me. In the end I took, because I can't see a better move, win a pawn check. Then I played check first, and I think for some reason I got scared and I did not take the a pawn, which is a key mistake. I shouldn't be afraid of these moves, and I completely miscalculated with this next turn, and I deserve to lose for this. This was a terrible move. If I take the pawn, it's still a fairly comfortable draw. Knight to e5, I'll drop the f-pawn, or so I thought. How do I save the f-pawn? What had I missed? I'd missed rook a7, where if he does rook takes pawn, I'll take the rook, and if he does knight takes pawn, I'll take his rook. So he cannot take my pawn on f. And if he'll most likely take the pawn on d, which will win him a pawn, but this is a draw. I can very comfortably say it's drawn. Like bishop g1 is good enough. So instead of finding this easy draw, I thought I could be clever, stopping knight e5 idea, winning my pawn. I hadn't seen rook a7, so I played bishop d4, absolutely dreadful move, and he instantly took me, and I suddenly realised I cannot take a4, because what would white do here to ensure victory? White would end up deflecting away my rook with king b3, and my bishop is embarrassed. Wherever I move the rook, I either lose the rook or I lose the bishop, and it's over. I can't survive this. So instead, I had to play bishop b6, trying to avoid his a-pawn being able to be defended. But Matthew found rook b5. I ran away. And then here, I think he may have made a slight error. I was scared of this move, but rook b4, saving the pawn. And I thought maybe I could cause some problems and make life a little difficult. I think he did not want to do this because I could take on f3 and maybe later take on h2. And he may have thought he wouldn't have enough pawns left to squeeze the win. But to be honest, I think this is the best chance for him to win the game. Instead, after after bishop d8, he played knight to e5 with the same idea as earlier. This time, though, I did not make the mistake of refusing the a-pawn. I took rook b7. Unfortunately, I don't have rook to a7 anymore because my bishop is on a much worse square. So I checked, and again traded a pawn. If I manage to get all the pawns off the board, it will be a draw. So that was the plan. Trade as many pawns as possible and just barely cling on to a draw. But he's made my king very, very weak and inactive. It's a horrible place for my king to be. He then played rook b7. What's his plan? So if I play, I don't know, h5, no, not h5, rook to h3 or something, what would he play here to win the game? Simple pin, rook to b8, and I resign. There's some other tactics as well, that are rife with tactics in this position. Another move which is very common is to put your bishop on the long diagonal, going corner to corner, h8 to a1, and the bishop usually can dominate the knight. But here, two loose pieces on the board. Loose pieces drop off, and I will lose the game. So instead, I played bishop a5. Knight g4 was played anyway, and I played rook check. Rook h3 is apparently the best move, but I thought I had a plan. If his king went to the c file, so c4, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I thought I had this check on c2, and then when his king moves, I can avoid his rook dominating my king by cutting it off on the 8th rank and being on the 7th by challenging his rook. And if he trades, even though he's a pawn up, I should draw, I think. Although he won't make it easy for me. So that was the plan, but he went to e4 instead, which is a better move. And then finally I was able to get the bishop onto the diagonal, corner to corner. He did not let me rest though, he played f5. So he's thinking his double pawns are what's causing him grief. They're not that powerful. So if he trades off one of those pawns, he'll be left with two very healthy pawns. And he's happy with that. I'm also happy because I want to trade as many pawns as I can. So we're both getting what we want. I did not take immediately though, because I was worried about his king starting to become active and running up the board. So first I offered the rook trade. Again, if we trade rooks, I think I can easily draw. Or it'll be easier to draw. Rook c7 to attack my rook, my bishop. And then I do trade, forcing off a pawn. And then bishop g7, stopping all the knight checks. And again, I think maybe he played a slightly inaccurate move, but again, it's hard to tell. I thought that f4 was the best plan. And the reason for this is that you can then play things like knight to e5. And if I take the knight, he'll take with the pawn and have a passed pawn, which is running up the board. But it's possible that if he does this here, I might just have enough to draw because I grabbed the g-pawn at the end. Although it's still very, very scary. I wouldn't want to be defending this position either. So he played a very sensible move though, I think. He played knight to e5. And here, again, I want to trade, and perhaps I made a slight error here, but I think it's a draw with best play. So I took, he took, and importantly, my king can defend from his f-pawn promoting to a queen on g8. It would take the queen when it turned up on the board, and at the same time, it's also guarding the one remaining pawn I have. So g8 is the perfect place for my king. My h-pawn needs to be next to my king, so I can't push the pawn up the board. So essentially, as long as I don't allow all his pawns to run up and his king to be uncheckable, if that's a word, or his king to be safe where I can't check it, and I cut the king off and slow progress, this should be a draw. But this is where Wadsworth plays fantastic moves, and his technical ability in these endings is very, very strong. So I was still not confident I could really draw this, even if a computer can draw it. So I'm cutting the king off, just like he's cutting my king off. He has to push pawns. I do a check, just to shut him down, and then waste a move. I don't have anything else to do. Then he kicks me around, and I come back across, cutting his king off more. So he's shuffling around, trying to make me do an error, which is very likely. And he follows my rule: always play f6 when you're white, never play it when you're black. So now he has certain rook checks on g7 and c8, which could be deadly. And here I end up playing the correct way of defending the position. Rook to a1, which is a very unnatural move if you don't know how to defend this or are working it out over the board and you're not very experienced at rook endings. Fortunately, I haven't had this exact position, but I've had games similar to this, and the idea is that his g-pawn needs to come up the board as well. So his king will need to move to h or to f, and wherever it goes I'll check on h or f myself, and his king won't find any shelter from the checks. So he shuffled the rook, seeing what I do, and then I'm cutting his king off laterally now, not horizontally. So his king needs to stay on g5. If it moves, I grab the f-pawn. So he shuffles around a bit, and I do the same. I'm staying on f. He checked me. King f7, and then came to h8. So here, big question, the key decision of the match. Do I take the pawn on f6? Or do I defend my h-pawn with rook to h2? So while trading the pawns is what I wanted, if I take this pawn, it is lost. Matthew would play takes, and the only move I have to save my rook is king to e6. But then he could trade rooks, and if I do any other move besides rook takes rook, I will just lose it for nothing. So I must take. He'll take back. His king is in front of his pawn, and this is a simple win. Even though I get to the square stopping promotion, his king will eventually shoulder me away, and then his pawn promotes to a queen, going to g7 and g8, and I will lose. So I could not take the pawn. I stood guard, rook h2, king f5, check. So now if king to e5, for example, this doesn't work because I can simply check again. I'm not going to take that pawn unless his king goes too far away. So if it goes to, say, d4, then I will take the pawn, because not even Matthew Wadsworth could win this game. That was probably fatal last words. But all I do is stand in front of the pawn on guard duty, and I just shuffle my rook up and down. His king can never come across to help him out, and the rook and pawn alone cannot overpower my king. So this is a draw. And if the rooks ever trade on e-file, so he puts his rook on, say, e3 or e4, I will trade rooks, and that's also a draw in that particular line. So he tried one last attempt. It was a good try, though. He went king back to g5. I went back to h2, repeating the position, and I for some reason had a brain freeze, and I thought I was claiming a draw by repetition, 3 moves, but we've only had this position twice, and it's kind of bad etiquette to offer 2 draws. So I'd offered a draw about move 40, I think, when I had thought I was roughly level, and so I thought I was claiming the draw, but I accidentally offered a second one here. It doesn't matter too much. He played rook b8, and then I found the easiest way to draw, or the fastest way to ensure that I don't have to defend this for another 40 moves. What did I play as black? Nice, simple move, h6 check, finally moving my h-pawn. He must move his king to the f-file, doesn't matter which one he moves it to. Then I check on f2, his king moves, and I grab the pawn. And this time I can take it. But he set me one last challenge. If he checks me on b7, I will go to g6, easy draw. He went rook f8, so one last roll of the dice. I take with the king, there's no other move. He takes here, and then I found the only... Actually, no, it's not the only drawing move, but it's by far the easiest, h5. So in this position, if I had played the move king g8, this does still draw after king g6, but then I have to find h5. And if I don't find it, his king will take and be in front of his pawn by 2 steps. So that's a win in all cases. And h5 is a draw if I find the correct move after king takes. The only way to draw is to get the opposition, king h7, standing in front of their king and them having the move. If they push their pawn, their king is no longer in front of it, so it's a draw. And if the king moves, I keep on standing in front of the king, and white makes no progress at all. So that was an alternative way to draw. I wasn't entirely certain I could, and also both of us are down to about a minute on our clock. So here I went h5. Very simple way to draw the game. If he lets me take, it might even be winning for me if he plays the wrong move. And if he plays g5, it also wins for me. So I would play h4, and then if he did something like king g8 going king h7, trying to push his own pawn, I would just stand in front of him. He can never push his own one, and my one's going to queen. So he isn't that silly. He played takes, and now the fact is his pawn is on the edge of the board, so all I have to do is put my king in the corner. Easy draw. So this happened, and stalemate draw. So I'm very happy to have drawn that match. I was either level or worse the whole game, so I didn't ever have an advantage in that match. And to have drawn in this manner against somebody whose strong suit is these sort of technical endings and positional play, I feel very good about that. So that's my second game of the tournament. First game was a bit of a non-starter. And tomorrow I am playing a FIDE master who is over 2300. So that should be an interesting match. Thanks for watching the video, and see you next time. Bye.